For those of you who don't know, the 92nd Street Y is a cultural and community center here in New York that reaches out all across the country. And by way of introduction, I want to tell you a story this evening about how I really got to know Stanford PACS and a little bit about why we've been here this afternoon and some of the reasons we're here this evening. So if you cast your minds back about a year, last summer, we began to think around Black Friday and Cyber Monday. So we have a Black Friday, we have a Cyber Monday, and we began to think at the 92nd Street Y, wouldn't it be interesting if after Black Friday and Cyber Monday, we had a Giving Tuesday? Wouldn't a Giving Tuesday be an interesting thing to start thinking about? After 2 days of getting, we would have a day of giving. What is the first thing you do when you have an idea like this? You call Stanford PACS. The very first thing you do. So my friend Rob, who we'll hear from this evening, has been a friend and mentor of mine. The first phone call we made was to Rob and said, Rob, we've had this idea. What you guys know about at Stanford more than anybody is this intersection between the philanthropic world and the digital world and how those things are going to fit together. And so really from the very genesis of the idea of Giving Tuesday, Stanford PACS got behind this in such a big way. From the first meetings that we had, we got together a group of people here in New York at the offices of Mashable. At that first meeting with 25 people in the room to sort of scale the idea and say, what do you think about this idea? Of those 25, about a third were connected to Stanford in one way or another. A lot of those people are here this evening. So even the genesis of the thinking came from our connectionship with Stanford. And I want to tell you a little bit about the results, because I know we're going to hear a lot about data this evening. So I will tell you a little bit about the data of Giving Tuesday. And we only really were able to achieve these kinds of results because of the mentorship and support of the relationship we have with Stanford PACS. So we launched this in September to a public audience. 70 days later, the first ever Giving Tuesday took place. Our goal was 100 partners. We could get 100 partners, for-profit, non-profit, all around the country. That would be a good result. The end number was 2,700. So we saw amazing results there. In terms of data, the increase in online giving for the same day a year before was 50% increase on the day. 50% increase in online giving. Cell phone donations went up. We heard this via PayPal. Cell phone donations went up almost 500% year to year on the day. Giving Tuesday trended #1. So the #1 thing that the internet wanted to talk about on that day was philanthropy. When was the last time that happened? Yeah, quite right too. And what was really interesting is a conversation led by a new generation did about a third of the traffic of Cyber Monday and about a half of Black Friday. So we came in a pretty creditable third in terms of what the internet wanted to talk about, and that was just year one. So we are so indebted to Stanford PACS, not just for being an inspiration, but for really helping grow a movement like Giving Tuesday, which was a new kind of an idea, and it was an innovative idea, and it only happened because we were able to have this kind of partnership. And I wrote a note to Kim after Giving Tuesday, a note of thanks saying, look, we are so very proud that for Giving Tuesday, our alma mater is Stanford. And she wrote a note back, which was the nicest compliment we had of the whole project. She said, there's good news, Giving Tuesday made the dean's list. So with that, it's my great privilege to introduce our host for the evening, Kim Meredith, and I'll introduce her with a note of gratitude for all the work she and her team have done to take this idea and really scale it nationally.
Well, as you all know, Henry is very modest, and he clearly is the thinking behind Giving Tuesday. I'm going to see if I can move over here just a little. Now I can see your faces. So thank you, Henry. That's very generous. But truly, Giving Tuesday would not have taken place if it wasn't for Henry's great vision. And the idea of thinking about how do you move social media to actually do social good. And that clearly is something that we're very interested in at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, Stanford PACS. and also with the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So I see a lot of new faces out here this evening, and I'm Kim Meredith, as Henry said, the Executive Director of Stanford PACS, and we are a research center where we bring together scholars, leaders, and practitioners to explore ideas for social change. We are also the publisher of the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So we like to say that we're actually in the business of knowledge creation through our research and original content for SSIR, knowledge sharing, and community building. We are a fully interdisciplinary center working with 5 schools and 20 departments, and that leads us to about 100 faculty affiliations. And this is our once-a-year activity here in New York to come together and share with our New York alumni and broader community what's going on with Stanford PACS and SSIR. So a number of wonderful things have happened in this past year. First, we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and if any of you are back on Stanford campus on May 8th, please join us as we celebrate the 10th anniversary. On September 1st, we had Paul Brest join our center. Many of you are Stanford alumni from the law school. I know there are a number of you here in the audience. And Paul was, of course, the dean of Stanford Law School, then went on to be president of the Hewlett Foundation for 12 years, and then on September 1st, joined our center as a faculty director. We also opened an office in China this year. So thanks to my friend Selig Sachs, who in March of 2011 brought me along on a trip with some of his business colleagues to China, just as Stanford was a little bit beyond breaking ground with their new center at the Stanford Peking University Center. And a year later, in March of 2012, we actually became one of the anchor tenants there. And I have to say, I've been there 4 times this year. So we have found that the community within China, whether it be the business community, the nonprofit community, or the philanthropic community, or government for that matter, is very interested in these topics around emerging civil society, philanthropy, and social innovation. So I'm very grateful to Selig for that leadership. And finally, we have also offered a postdoc position to a young China scholar. So we're getting serious about this. And we are also looking at another PhD candidate for our fellowship this upcoming year. So there's much going on at the center. We have our classes, we have PhD fellows, we have postdocs, we have undergraduate researchers, we match them with faculty, and in fact, Tom Ehrlich, another dean of the law school from days of the past, has co-authored a book with one of our undergraduate researchers that will be coming out in August. They are 57 years apart, and it's called Civic Work, Civic Life. So look forward to that. So with that, though, of course, a research center can't have any importance on a university campus such as Stanford if we don't have faculty who are engaged in research and pushing out new ideas, new content, and thinking. So we have 4 research initiatives going on. We have our social innovation research project that is led by Johanna Mayer, who is the academic editor of SSIR. And that work is funded through the Rockefeller Foundation, and we are looking at organizational capacity to continuously innovate. And we published an article last fall, Innovation is Not the Holy Grail, that actually speaks to that and talks in terms of how innovation is more of a process, possibly, and not just a one-time output. So it looks at internal ecosystems within organizations, the external factors that put pressure on you as you attempt to innovate. And then it also asks really important questions around, if you're innovating, are you actually having impact? So look for that article from last fall, and be sure to look ahead when our May issue comes out of SSIR, because there's some interesting work that will be shared at that point. Our second big research project is led by Woody Powell. And Woody is an expert in nonprofit management and organizational theory. So he is actually looking at the discourse on evaluation in the nonprofit sector. And he's looking, they've got a web crawler they've invented, they've got foundation to foundation discussions, foundation to nonprofit discussions going on. And we're really looking to see what is the language that is being used around evaluation in the nonprofit sector. Is it managerial, scientific, or is a new language being invented? And I would say it's probably the latter, so stay tuned for that. Third faculty director, Paul Brest, as I indicated, who joined us in September, he is the, what would you say, leading the charge on the discussions of performance management in the nonprofit sector. Great article last fall also on a decade of outcome-oriented philanthropy, so read that on SSIR, but also look ahead to the fact that sort of that next layer of discussion around performance management, he is focused in on impact investing. What are the trade-offs between social returns and financial returns? What is it that's motivating donors or investors to engage in impact investing? So I think it will be a really interesting study. We have 2 MBAs working with them, 2 undergraduates, some folks from Goldman Sachs and Imprint Capital. So very inclusive cross-sector look at impact investing. And then finally, that leads us to our speakers tonight. Faculty Director Rob Reich and Lucy Bernholz. Their research, the Philanthropy, Policy, and Technology Project, or ReCoding Good for the 21st Century. And so tonight we are going to hear from them, but we have been supporting this work now for a year and a half. They have been bringing in together, truly using our tagline, scholars, practitioners, and leaders. We've hosted multiple charrettes or workshops with that mix of participants, the sharing economy, Citizens United, impact investing, big digital public goods, big data from government. And in fact, we had that discussion a year ago in the design school, and last weekend, bringing it full circle, we hosted a Good Jobs challenge using data from government, from LinkedIn, from GuideStar, for the social sector, working with teams of students where we had coders and builders mixed with do-gooders, hustlers and change makers, as we say, looking to see where are those gaps in terms of social services? Where could jobs be created? How could we create a platform for a common application to nonprofits? It's very difficult for young people to engage in the nonprofit sector. Yet, as the White House shared with everyone during the discussion, the reality is it has been the fastest area of job growth in our economy. And that really leads me to this point around philanthropy. It's approximately $300 billion. So, plus or minus the past few years. It's about 2% of our GDP. Yet, those funds are funding nonprofits, and nonprofits are 10% of our labor force. So think about that. So that connection between a year ago, Rob and Lucy talking about big digital public goods. Last weekend, we bring together all of these students in addition to the venture community and the tech community, and we look at how can we be creating economic opportunities for those 18 to 24-year-olds, 18 to 30-year-olds within the civil society sector. So we know that philanthropy is primarily individuals. About 81% individuals compared to foundations, which are 14%, and corporations, which are 5%. Some of you in the room know that. Others of you, that's a startling recognition of where those philanthropic dollars are coming from. And it's really led to a lot of interesting discussions this year within our government as we've talked about taxes. And in fact, what are these issues around philanthropy being a part of society, and what is the role, whether it be from an individual or from a foundation side? So certainly we saw giving increase when charitable tax deductions and incentives went into place. The question is, do you really need that? Should there be differences in terms of who might be receiving what kinds of deductions? Much discussion around churches. Should they be receiving tax deductions? But in a general sense, you can see that it's a part of that 12% of discretionary spending that potentially gets affected. When you think about how that affects nonprofits, that $300 billion in philanthropy driving nonprofits on an aggregate basis 30% of the revenue for nonprofits comes from government. So when we start talking about that 12% discretionary spending and the cuts that are going on there, you can see that the strategic value in that relationship between philanthropy, nonprofits, taxes, all comes together. If there are less government dollars going to nonprofits, the strategic value of philanthropy becomes even more important. So there are many trends in philanthropy, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think just being aware that it is such a robust field, there is much opportunity for research at a center such as ours, much opportunity for new content and original ideas being put out through the Stanford Social Innovation Review in addition to scholarly research. And so just to be aware of all of these many trends as we start getting ourselves anchored in the discussion that Rob and Lucy will lead around the new social economy. But I think when you look at it, you can see there's shared value. Corporations coming together with communities. There's new hybrid corporations, B corporations, and LLC3, B being for benefit, that you don't necessarily have to just drive shareholder value. And then you see these cross-sector collaborations or collective impact. So in a general sense, there's this incredible blurring of the lines, where some of us might have started out on a track, corporate America, business or government, or a nonprofit at some point in our career. Today, the young people that we see, the students we're engaged with, we have some of them here in the room, some recent and current Tom Ford Fellows in philanthropy, they can come into the realm and say, this whole opportunity to blend and see how they can make impact no matter what sector they go in. So with that, I bring on to stage Rob Reich and Lucy Bernholz to talk about ReCoding Good for the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thanks, Kim. So the expectation here is that I'm technologically savvy enough to do all of these things at once?
Just that way.
Okay.
If I can do it, you can do it.
I'll do it.
No, that's fine. I can do it. I was just hoping this worked. This doesn't work? I have to do this? Okay. No, I'm good with a finger. Thanks. So I'm Lucy Bernholz, and this is Rob. I just saw the movie 42, so it's always good to make sure you're clear who's who in a room. If you haven't seen 42, you should see 42. It's about Jackie Robinson. So 10 minutes from me, 10 minutes from Rob, and then questions and answers, or questions and questions seem to be more our style. Kim mentioned the ReCoding Good project. Let me give you one more piece of background, because we're really going to talk to you about sort of the middle of the research, the middle of the thinking, not the beginning, and we're not at the end yet. So the beginning was that Rob and I came to realize we had both been thinking about the changes in philanthropy and nonprofits that were underway, that we are all living through, that seemed to be coming from, in very broad strokes, sort of two places. One is from the market, and an increase over the last 2 decades of interest and experimentation in market-based solutions or proposed solutions to shared social challenges, so social enterprise to impact investing. So there's a whole bunch of work we've done and thinking we've done about the market-based side of things and what that means. And then the other big force of change are digital technologies. And the work I'm going to talk about today, this concept of digital civil society, has roots in both of those things, but it's very much from the digital side of things. So, and I'm also going to do something that you've probably never had happen, and I don't think there's a Stanford professor, I'm not one, so I'll have to ask the Stanford professor this, who's ever done this on stage, which is I'm going to make you a guarantee. Okay?
Go for it.
I'll make him again.
Back, right?
Rob's like, I don't want anything to do with this. I guarantee that this is going to shape the rest of your work, life, and giving, unless you're going to live beyond the year 2100. Digital civil society is going to be part of of how you need to think about these things. So that's the guarantee. It's not necessarily going to replace analog, but it's here to stay. and I don't make guarantees that last more than 2100, so that's why I'm not going any further than that. And when we talk about digital civil society, I'm not talking about nonprofit websites. Okay, we're well past that. This is not just about the use of social media or the internet or mobile phones. It's about what does it mean if we start building out our spaces for the shared use of private resources with a public purpose when those things are built out upon digital technologies. So nonprofit websites, static, flash-enabled, video-enabled, whatever you want, that's all kind of background. We're trying to look at what happens when you begin to really work from a digital infrastructure. And I find that there's a useful analogy here. I am actually a native New Yorker, and I now live in San Francisco, so I'm very much a coast kind of gal. So this was a good metaphor for me, and I'm just going to ask you to bear with me for the next 10 minutes. I want you to think of the places where water and land come together, coasts. They tend to be gorgeous. Many of us like to live on them. They can also be quite treacherous, and that's where we are right now. So for the purposes of this talk, land is analog and money-based. Water is digital and data-based. And where we are right now is right where this picture puts us, where those two things come together. Now, when I say analog, land-based, and money-based, I want you to think about the nonprofit sector and philanthropy that you've grown up with and that you're quite familiar with. That is a set of organizations that are chartered under a corporate code to serve any of a number of social purposes or charitable purposes. But what fundamentally distinguishes those enterprises from the business down the street or the government agency around the corner are rules about money. That's what distinguishes a not-for-profit organization from a for-profit organization, is what they do with the money. Where do they get it? What do they do with the profits they make? So non-profit does not mean you can't have more revenue than expenses. It means any profits you have to be used for the purpose, the social purpose of the enterprise. And so the rules that structure these things, what makes them unique is, in the corporate code view of the world, are rules about money. And they've been very, very productive rules. The system has worked quite well for at least 100 years. We've got a very robust nonprofit sector in this country and a growing one around the world. I'm not necessarily yet criticizing any of those rules about money, but I want you to just sort of keep that in mind, because what we have are a lot of rules about money. We don't have any rules about data. And when I talk about data, I want to dispel the myth that we're now going to have a lecture on performance management or impact outcome measures. When I talk about data, I want you to think about absolutely anything that can be digitized. And I mean anything from you to me to houses, which can be now built in a 3D printer, to living animals. This is actually a 3D statue built from a live rat. Nice, huh? It can be digitized. Concrete, tangible things, the chair you're sitting on, can now be digitized. And once things are ones and zeros, they're not necessarily useful data, but they actually are data in the sense that they're binary bits of ones and zeros that are indistinguishable from other ones and zeros. Other things that we know and love are also being digitized in this way. Online education, or offline education as it moves online and goes long distance. So MOOCs, if you're not familiar with the term, massive open online classes. Healthcare is being digitized. All kinds of innovations in how to provide people with access to general medical providers and nurse practitioners using text messages. It's happening all over the place. There are now, in just the last several months, there are 3 that I know of, websites that have launched that were crowdfunding surgery for people around the world. And community organizing. Giving Tuesday is a great example of a digital version of what used to be an analog behavior, bringing people together around something that they care about. And that's really what we're talking about here. We are talking about the use of private resources for a public purpose now happening in a digital domain. So we've got a whole bunch of rules about money. We've got no rules about data. And unfortunately, they're not the same thing. Or fortunately, I don't know how you can feel about that any way you want. But simply enough, they're not the same thing. They don't work the same way. They work differently in some very important ways. For example, if I have $1, you can't have it. Well, if I give it to you, then I don't have it anymore. But if I've got data, if I've got an idea, I can have it. If I've got a digital anything, ask the record companies about this one. If I've got a digital something, you can all have copies. And nothing's happened to mine. We've all got it, and your copies are as good as the original. So there's a lot of fascinating economic research about the way data move, the way digital bits and bytes move, but the fundamental nature of them is that they're shareable in a way that money isn't. They're scalable in a way that money isn't. And they're storable in ways and over periods of time that we don't know how to plan for. So the two core assets, the money for the land-based analog nonprofit sector is still here, still working, but we've got this new asset, this new thing, this new way of organizing that's built on these digital bits. We don't have rules about it, and we know that it works differently than the other thing. Water's not the same as land. There's the picture, see? I'm ahead of myself or behind myself. When you think particularly around philanthropy, there's a couple of things, there's a couple of key questions that we're coming to realize we as a society are going to need to be able to answer before we can even know if we need to rewrite the rules for philanthropy and nonprofits. So back to my analogy, back to the rules about money. In our current system, the rules that separate nonprofits from for-profits and government agencies are about who owns the money and who gives the money, who benefits from the money, and how you distribute the money. So substitute the word data in each of those sentences. Who owns the data? Who gives the data? Who uses the data? Who's going to store that data and for just how long? We don't have answers to these questions. That's what needs to be created as we're heading into this digital civil society. Now, the good news is, I feel like I have a tail. The good news is, we're not the first ones out there, okay? We've actually been heading down this path for about 20 years. And the really good news is, this guy, Larry Lessig, who used to be a professor at Stanford, got there before a lot of us did. How many of you have read anything by Lessig? Yeah, fabulous, fabulous work. He's left for some other university on the East Coast, but we'll forgive him. Larry Lessig is a law professor. He's written a number of books about how digital property moves. And I bring him into the equation here because I want to give you a couple stories about nonprofits that I think you'll be familiar with that are already the canaries in the coal mine, if you will, of what it's like to operate in this digital civil society. So Larry Lessig is a lawyer, very interested in how the digital economy works. Got involved with a guy named Eric Eldred, who put together in the late 1980s and early 90s, which you can tell just by looking at this screenshot, right, dates itself automatically. He put together his own press. This was Eldritch Press. And he was publishing open access, what we now today call open access. The language didn't exist back then, but links that would allow you to read Henry David Thoreau and Herman Melville and a lot of works that he was interested in, and he saw this great technology, and he realized, I can put this stuff up on the internet, and anybody can get access to it, and anybody can read it. And in 1998, the US Congress passed a law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, also known as the Sonny Bono Copyright Extension Act, which put a whole bunch of new rules, longer rules, on how long an author would own the rights to her written work. And the result of that was to make many of the things that Eldred had put on his press illegal. He couldn't post them anymore. They had gone back into copyright. And Eric Eldred sat down with Larry Lessig and said, this isn't right. That's not the way copyright's supposed to work. Shouldn't happen this way. These should be public domain works. Blah, 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 blah. Big lawsuit. I'm blah, 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 only because you really want to hear from Rob. It's actually a really good story. As they were negotiating this and thinking about the lawsuit that would eventually make it to the Supreme Court, and Lessig and Eldred would lose, they realized that they kept stumbling across this idea of a nature conservancy for digital works, that there ought to be some way to protect this stuff the way we protect land. So, we're back to that metaphor again, but some way of taking ideas and art and music and writing that was digitized, that was in the public domain, and keeping it available. And that idea became Creative Commons after a lot of back and forth and to and fro, and it was not any kind of a straight line. But how many of you are familiar with Creative Commons? So quite a few of you. It's an alternative copyright regime that gives the creator of the work several choices. I think there's 6 different choices. One of them is in use right down there in the lower left-hand corner of this slide deck, that lets Rob and me say, you can use this if you want. Go ahead, go for it. We're not going to sue you if you use these slides. In fact, we want you to share it and share it alike. And Creative Commons, which launched officially in 2001, I think, 2001, 2002, 10 years old. It's now got affiliates in 70 countries. It's the law of the land in Brazil. So Creative Commons is the default standard by which creative works are licensed in the country of Brazil. And it's chartered as a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in the Bay Area. It operates across 70 different national copyright regimes. They're not the same thing. It operates in all those different languages. It's generally put into place by a group of people within a country who take it upon themselves to figure out how to make these rules or something like them apply in their case. And a lot of what the staff of Creative Commons do is help people navigate that complicated legal terrain in whatever country they're operating in. It's also it's a website of licenses that anyone can go to, download, and use. So there are, I believe, 700 million works licensed under Creative Commons licensing in just 10 years. That's sort of, any one of you can go to this website and download this and become part of this community and use it this way. It's been an extraordinary social movement. So that's example number 1 of a nonprofit organization operating in a space where its only asset, what it's doing, everything it exists to do, is digital. How many of you are familiar with the Firefox browser? So you may have this on your laptop, you're already using it. Did you know that it was created by a not-for-profit organization? So the Mozilla Foundation is another 501c3 nonprofit. It makes a browser. It makes this browser precisely to compete with Internet Explorer and Apple Safari. It is open source software. It's managed by hundreds of thousands of volunteers around the world. It's one of the most used products in internet software history, and it is completely created and managed by a community of developers around the world who keep the software open, require it to be able to be used and changed, make sure that it's a competitive product with those two, the corporate competitors from Apple and Microsoft, and in fact has been credited with much of the innovation that's gone on in those other browsers. They have had to add things to those products to keep up with this one. Again, 501c3 nonprofit is mostly funded through a licensing deal with Google for ad revenue and a very complicated global community of developers who make this thing work. Last example, how many of you know what this is? Anybody used it? All of you have used it. Every single one of you, because every month, 13% of the people on the internet go to Wikipedia. That's a lot of people. There's 270 languages. Wikipedia is available in 270 languages. There are 35 million people who make Wikipedia work. That's not those of us who just go to look up, is Rob Reich the King of England? That's the people who make it work. 35 million people make this thing work in 270 languages. 13% of the internet 13% of internet users go to it every month. It's typically in the top 5 or 6 websites by traffic, and all of the others are corporate owned. You're talking Amazon and Google and those guys. The logo beneath it is for the Wikimedia Foundation. Guess what? It's a nonprofit. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wait a minute, didn't she just say 35 million people make this thing happen? Any of you ever run a nonprofit? You want to run a nonprofit with 35 million people with opinions? It's a problem. From the perspective of people in the Wikimedia community, this is actually what the organization looks like. You use a little philanthropic jargon. You thought your theory of change was complicated. How'd you like this for an org chart? These are examples. Creative Commons, Wikimedia, and Mozilla are examples of people trying to make change in the world, whether it's an online free encyclopedia, an internet browser that will make sure that there is no lockdown of the code that we use the very thing we use to get onto the internet, or variation in how people can own their digital assets and share them in a digital age. These are examples of people trying to make that change happen and forcing themselves into the nonprofit structure because it's the best available, not because it's the best possible. It really doesn't work well in the digital age. What we're in now, so those are the anchor institutions. Let me speed this up. We are continuing to innovate. And all of civil society, so those are sort of, if those are the canaries in the coal mine, the question is, yeah, well, but I'm not going to create an online encyclopedia. What does this have to do with me? Well, we now, as of last week, have a digital public library of America. If ever there's sort of a prototypical civic institution, it's probably the library. We have open museums, that stands for open galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, where it's all about digital artifacts. And the Public Library of Science is this other logo down there. So those core functions of our civil society, we now have entirely digital versions of. We also have entirely digital versions of things that you might be directly involved in. DoSomething.org is a teen mobilization site. It works with teens all over the country. It's almost entirely based on SMS text messaging, a teen version, if you will, of, I'll say boys and girls clubs, but that's not really quite right, but the analogy holds. Then we've got these online registries of patient information, back to the DNA slide that was up there before. This is a huge advance. These are 3 different organizations making extraordinary advances in medical research. It's all about the data. The top ones here, Crisis Commons and CrowdMap, 2 extraordinary resources used in disaster response. Again, we're migrating our analog civil society actions into this digital environment. City car share and relay rides, I don't know if either one of these is here, but I know you have Zipcar and probably some other ones. These are versions of car sharing services. And then Samasource is a job creation site. So we're starting to see these sort of everyday activities, not just the canaries in the coal mine, moving digitally. Why is this important? Anybody notice anything about this list of things? Depends on how well you know these things. They're not all nonprofits. On the internet, nobody knows you're a nonprofit. Dog thinks it's about a dog, but it's really about nonprofits. We have an economy, what Rob and I refer to as the social economy, of providers of services who are doing things that we think are nonprofit. They feel nonprofit, they feel do-goody, but they're not necessarily being provided by nonprofits. Just to go backwards here, Relay Rides is a VC-backed startup. Crisis Commons is an informal network of volunteers. There is no organizational structure. And of these data registries for medical research, Patients Like Me is a for-profit company. So we have, driven by the way data can move and the way organizations can be set up, we have this interesting blend of structures in our new digital civil society. And we're going to need some rules about them. We're going to need to ask ourselves how we want to hold these organizations accountable and to whom. We're still at those same earlier questions I asked you about who owns the data and what can they do with it and for how long can they do it. We actually are going to need to think about a whole new set of governance structures that will help us succeed in this water-based environment. This is sort of where we are now. This is about as good as it gets. Now it works, right? We got a little bit of the analog. We took the country house and we put it on pontoons. It floats. I'm not sure I'd want to head out past the Statue of Liberty with it. But that's where we are, and what the ReCoding Good project is trying to figure out is what are the elements of a much more agile set of organizations or organizational structures that we need to be thinking about, that we can start learning from the Creative Commons and the Wikimedias of the world and pull forward, if you will, to create organizations and enterprises and ways of working that will last for the next 100 years. So that's what the ReCoding Good project is all about.
All right, let me add some background context to how both Lucy and I are thinking about this broad question of digital civil society as a way of focusing your attention on the need to think about the rules that will help structure our use of data. So I want to give you 3 different big picture thoughts about data. And the first is just to pick up where Lucy left off, which is to imagine a world in which, in analog form, we attempt to carry certain things out with a public purpose. And that might mean, when we transition to the digital world, much more easily going to scale because, as Lucy described, data travels much more freely, can travel much more broadly. The costs of dissemination are so much lower. So just for example, take the Giving Tuesday successful experiment from last year. Imagine 15 years ago, Henry Timms has this idea that it'd be great to try and build out a new national day of giving on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. And he thought, well, let's get together my staff at the 92nd Street Y and we'll pass out some flyers up on the Upper East Side and we'll get a few volunteers who can try and bring those flyers into the community and we'll get a bunch of people to give some money away on Tuesday after Thanksgiving up around the 92nd Street Y as a hub, using face-to-face contact and paper as the way of getting that job done. And then you might think, oh, let's go one better. Let's open up a satellite Y campus or building downtown in New York City. And now we'll not only organize uptown, we'll organize downtown, but we'll use the same analog methods. Would have taken a lot of work, a lot of staff time, a lot of volunteer time. And what Henry didn't tell you, what I find so extraordinary about the effort that happened last year, fully imagines from the start as a digital enterprise. So this was an idea that didn't exist in March or April of 2012. And that was brought together through phone calls, through a bit of volunteer time, and imagined from the start as something that would live on the internet. There was never a full-time or even part-time paid staff member working on Giving Tuesday. There was some volunteer time, but people who were doing it in their spare time, essentially. Then using the internet as a way, using a hashtag, using social media, using various different ways of getting partner organizations themselves to take ownership of the effort and spread it through their own social media efforts. The idea that an idea which doesn't exist in March of 2012 by Tuesday after Thanksgiving in the same year could have spread as widely as Giving Tuesday did, raising millions of dollars, is the promise of digital civil society. Because if Henry had just tried to organize up on the Upper East Side, it might have been a successful effort. in an analog form, but never would have had the scale or reach or power that it did in digital civil society. So part of the promise of digital civil society, of thinking about data, is how imagining from the very start what you can do online using the low cost of putting things online, the ease of transmission online, the sense in which, as Lucy described, you can replicate online very, very quickly, leads to all sorts of new possibilities. So that's just the existence of moving from an analog to a digital world. That's space one. I think another good example would be your library, which exists in a physical location. Go to check a book out. Now you have the digital public library. It's the equivalent of taking an analog institution, putting it online, and it just broadens access immediately. Now think about two other dimensions of this question that Lucy hasn't called attention to but are super important. And here I think it's where the rules are even more important for us to think about. When we put things online, what is the actual infrastructure over which those bits, those ones and zeros, travel? Well, we refer to this thing as the web or the internet, but what is the web or the internet? There was this big debate, of course, a while ago around SOPA PIPA and net neutrality. And one way to think about this is that something like the US Postal Service was one of the initial examples of something that was net neutral. The Postal Service existed as a way of taking some bits and data that Lucy had that she wanted to send to someone else, and the post office would take it, wouldn't ask any questions about its content, and it would deliver it wherever it could send the mail. And you paid a small amount of money for it. If the internet is important as an infrastructure, like the delivery of mail, like a phone system, in which it never asks questions, who's sending what to whom and what the content of the package is that's being sent, that's something like net neutrality, we have to pay attention to the actual infrastructure of the web. Because if it turns out that the infrastructure of the web can be turned into something that's not net neutral, or perhaps, maybe even worse, something that it is at the behest of a corporate entity always interested in profiteering, in which you don't get access to the web unless you first pay a big sum to get access. Imagine sending a letter and being told that actually the US Postal Service does not prefer to take your 44-cent stamp, that it will take yours, but not yours. It would deny you something that you thought was an infrastructure entitlement. Same with the phone bill. Now, of course, that's a for-profit entity, but you all know when you get your phone bill, if you look at it really closely, there's all kinds of additional charges which fund access to the phone network for people who are low income. And we have similar efforts these days, usually it goes around the moniker the digital divide, to get people online at low cost. So there's the infrastructure question of the web itself. What will be the rules that govern the actual medium over which all of the data travel? And that's all being worked out now as we speak. We don't yet have a robust set of rules about it. And the more and more that the web becomes a ubiquitous part of our life, in which we can hardly imagine living even a life of basic entitlements, the more the web comes to feel like an infrastructure not too different from the postal service, not too different from the telephone, not too different from the public utility. And that has big implications for how the web actually works. So you've got the bits and data as the goods themselves that flow over the web. And then you've got the infrastructure of the web itself as a public good, as something that's really valuable. And then the third thing I'd call attention to is the permissions that we have to say things digitally and to do things with other people together digitally. So it's free speech rights or association rights. In the analog world, the infrastructure that protects our ability to say what we want and to associate with whom we please is called the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects our liberty to say what we want and to do things in concert with other people. Online, think about what Twitter is or what Facebook is. Those are places to congregate with other people and to say things. But if you took a look at the cover story in the New Republic, just released today or yesterday, it's a story about how Facebook has something called the delete police or the delete crew. It's the monitoring system for what is permissible to say on Facebook. Moreover, Facebook has the permission to allow you to friend or not to friend someone, or to deny you the permission to friend or not friend someone. Facebook is the equivalent, its corporate policy is the equivalent of a First Amendment. Now, of course, it's not the substantive equivalent of the First Amendment. It does something, its terms of service lay out the permissions you have to do things or not to do things online. Similarly with Twitter, similarly with all these other things, as more and more of our speech and our association with others goes online, becomes digital, well, who owns what we say? Who can see with whom we're associating? Who has the right to decide whether I'm permitted to say something or not online? Who has the right to decide whether or not I'm allowed to associate with other people online? These are questions which we have more or less figured out in the analog world, but which are just now being articulated as questions in the digital world. And if we fail to see that these are questions worth asking, policies in need of development, we will miss something very important that we take for granted in the analog world that will suddenly seem to be an issue downstream in the digital world. So, digital civil society. We've tried to give you all kinds of reasons to feel some great amount of optimism about what this portends for the future. The Giving Tuesday experiment is one of the great examples of it, I think. We've also tried to say how we are convinced that broader and deeper thinking about the rules of these three aspects of digital civil society, the goods that live online, the fact that there are digital books to check out, how should we think about those? About the infrastructure itself over which these bits travel. How do we think about the net as a good in itself, independent of the things that stream over it? And finally, the infrastructure that protects any individual's free expression or free association online. What are the rules that will let us work that out in the future? That's the enterprise that we think is really important for all of us to attend to, and that we in this project hope at least to call attention to. So now, I would really welcome your questions, comments, and of course, contributions as answers to this project. Thanks very much. All right.
What role does digital currency play in what you're thinking about?
You're thinking of Bitcoin, I'm assuming.
Well, a empirical answer to your question would be I know of one nonprofit and one cupcake store that are taking Bitcoins as currency right now. The Internet Archive is actually taking donations. But to a broader answer to your question, I don't know how it will work as a financial investment. Certainly, digital technologies have already been quite successful in enabling a number of transfers of an alternative currency, not Bitcoin, but cell phone minutes, have become a very valuable currency in parts of the world, have been very powerful in changing economic behavior in various parts of the world. I think the thing about Bitcoin per se is it's complicated enough that the basic element of trust that we as humans still seem to have for good old analog somethings, I don't think that's going to switch that quickly. So I don't have a short answer to your question. Bitcoin per se is just barely sort of entering into this economy. We have seen mobile phones in developing countries be used and have a pretty profound effect as a means of transferring currency. But the details of Bitcoin per se are unknown to me as how that will work in this space.
So in terms of, you mentioned at the top of your presentation that you look at things in terms of up to the year 2100. Do you think the maturity of such a digital currency is relevant, or are you just not sure yet?
I think we'll have an awful lot of experiments, and if you give me a 100-year window, I'd say absolutely. There will be, I would, yeah, if you want to make a 100-year bet, I think we'll have some sort of global digital currency 100 years from now. Absolutely.
I'll add, just to pick up on one thing that Lucy mentioned. The success of a digital currency will depend very, very much on the trust that the users of the currency place in the system that's built up over time that deploys the currency. That's true of regular currency as well as it would be of a digital currency. And one of the things that at the moment is an open question is whether or not the entity that helps build the infrastructure of the digital currency out is a for-profit, a non-profit, or some quasi-public institution. And if you ask yourself the question, if Facebook or Goldman Sachs decided to start issuing currency that you were permitted to use, would you think that you would want to place the trust in that entity along with the coordination of lots of other people whose trust would also have to be present in order for that actually to work itself out? Or would you think a nonprofit entity would be more likely to gain the trust of users, or perhaps neither, and we need something like an independent political institution? Those are all questions, and I would agree with Lucy that basically I would predict we'll see experiments with for-profit entities, nonprofit entities, and quasi-public entities experimenting with digital currency. In the same way we see experiments these days in online learning, where there are for-profit companies in the game like Coursera and Udacity, as well as nonprofit entities like Stanford's Class2Go or the Harvard-MIT combo edX. And then there will also be downstream, I predict, open source public, quasi-public entities that are made available by states and localities.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Yep.
I'm a Stanford grad who's sort of a dinosaur. I don't know if you can be both in this day and age. I'm a person who uses email, and I go online. I'm a pretty good researcher, being a history major. But I don't have Facebook. I don't Twitter. I don't do any social media, which is actually why I was here today. But I'm just kind of curious, because I was switching from a Hewlett-Packard to a Mac. And I put everything on hard drives, and I'm still trying to figure out, I'm not asking the technical questions, but I'm trying to figure out how I get my, what do they call, Western Digital something or others to work on my Mac from my Hewlett-Packard. And I'm thinking, why didn't I just go to a cloud? Why didn't I put everything on a cloud? So I kind of like to know what kind of ownership I would have, because one reason I'm not on Facebook is I don't like to give away my pictures, and I think they own your pictures. I don't want to necessarily just jump to a cloud because it's an easy thing to do. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about you're talking about the trust,
Yep.
With the Bitcoins and stuff. What's the trust when you start putting all your stuff on a cloud? And what are the rules,
The rules are back up, back up, back up. The cloud is an interesting concept. And to Rob's point about Facebook's terms of service, I mean, on the one hand, the cloud is a critical part of the digital infrastructure that's really enabling a lot of ways we can work together differently, because you always have access to whatever it is. But again, you're playing by the rules of, literally under the terms of service of whoever your particular provider of that storage is. And there's, I don't know, dozens, hundreds. I can't even imagine how many there are. In most cases, I think, someone here will surely correct me, there are rules to be careful about or make your own personal decision about regarding, do they own what you've put there? Can they give up under subpoena your stuff when they're subpoenaed? Can they share? Can they derive? Whoever the they is. So yes, if you're using a cloud service, unless you happen to have your own server farm, and you're writing your own rules about this, which don't rule it out. We'll probably all have server farms embedded in our ears in a week or so, I don't know. You're sort of playing on somebody else's playing in somebody else's sandbox. And those are the issues that need to be considered, is what rights are you either giving to them or sharing with them? What are they legally obligated to do or capable of doing if the government comes a-knockin'? And what can they derive from what you've put up there? And in some cases, companies have tried to write terms of service that said, oh, you're going to share all your photos with us. Well, if we decide we like them, we're going to use them in market, we're going to sell them for marketing purposes. Didn't go over very well. But it's like a weekly education in reading the terms of service, which are, by definition, the things nobody reads.
I'd add to that the following observation. I am certainly no expert on studying the business models of internet companies, but I think you'd agree with the following rough generalization. For many companies like Facebook or Twitter or any of the other, Google, the things we use on a daily basis, the business model is to give the product away to the user for free and to figure out some other way to monetize by using the actual data and the inputs that the users produce for the company. And as they continue to give the product away for free and build up the community, they can learn, using all of these big data analytics, about different ways of slicing and dicing the data in order to monetize in different ways. Now, the upshot of that is we can be lulled as consumers into thinking that this product that we have come to rely upon, and even consider the contents of which to be something that we believe to be private, even though in the back of our heads we know that it might not be. The idea that the U.S. mail, it's a felony to open someone else's mail, including the post office purposefully to open your mail to look at it. But Google can scan our mail all the time and serve us customized ads based on the content of it. So I think if you pay even just a little bit of attention to the terms of service, you know that this is happening in the background. But the fact remains that as a company, Google or Facebook or Twitter could decide, if it wished, at its own behest, with no one else to decide otherwise, that it could start charging for its service. Now, you might think that's just another way to monetize a different business model. Think about what happened in the media industry, in the newspaper industry, when the initial move, some say the original sin of the newspaper industry, was to give away the content of the newspaper online for free. Once that had settled into the reader's mind as the expectation, attempts to monetize the content by charging or gating things behind a paywall came to be much, much more difficult. And it's only after long experimentation that a few companies, like Wall Street Journal or New York Times, have begun to be even modestly successful at monetizing, because they had set into the consumers, their readers' expectations, the idea that online is free. But of course, their permission always existed for them to charge for it. So that's just another way of saying, not only might the cloud service go away at an instant's notice and you lose your content, unless you read the fine print of the terms of service to see what's owed to you, the cloud service can decide to start charging for continuing access to what's in the cloud whenever it decides to do so. And that's just another garden variety feature of what it means to have a for-profit business. Question over here.
Hi. I had a question about sort of government. These ideas in civil society. What success have these ideas had in sort of penetrating government? And are you seeing government figures taking a lead in this, or is this something which is sort of purely academic at this point?
I didn't hear the first part of the question, so which ideas, the policy implications of what we've been talking about?
Yeah, kind of who's thinking about civil society in a digital way, who has their hands on the levers of power right now, and if they're not, how do you make that change?
Yeah, great question. We'll take any and all suggestions. It's interesting. One of the products of our first year of work here will be to put out, and we should have this in the next 2 months or so, what we're calling a policy forecast, which is first to identify all of the different policy domains that actually matter here. If you think about many of the issues that Rob or I have mentioned, such as net neutrality or intellectual property or copyright law. There are all kinds of advocacy organizations, many of them organized as not-for-profits, who are participating in a lively and robust political policy debate about those issues. Rob mentioned SOPA and PIPA, which had as players on the stage, if you will, everyone from the Recording Industry of America, which is a not-for-profit organization, to Google, to individuals on the street, to the Electronic Frontier Fund. I mean, they're all on different sides here. I'm deliberately mixing that up. So if you take it policy by policy, nonprofits are a big part of the mix. If you think about who's representing the interests of civil society writ large around these issues in toto, I would say actually that's part of what we're trying to do, is to instill these messages or raise the awareness of these issues by those groups. And we're having very little success because the key policy issue that those organizations have chosen to focus on for the last 2 years has been the charitable tax deduction, end of discussion, end of sentence. That's it. That's the policy issue. So that's that. It also depends on whether you're talking about at the state level or the federal level. That's sort of a federal story. Some differences at the state level.
Henry, I'd make a general observation about that because I think it's of the utmost importance that government at all levels figures out a way in which to make the best use of data. And if you've been reading up on some of the books that have been put out just over the past 6 months that touch on this topic, so there's a new book out by Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, and Jared Cohen, who was the digital policy advisor at the State Department, that expresses an optimistic view about how digital technology is going to change the world for the better. You've got places like the Singularity Institute, which believes that we are going to live forever within a short amount of time because of the advancements in technology that make it possible. And especially in the part of the world where Stanford's located, it's one of its chief and most laudable characteristics is its relentless future-oriented optimism. And it builds into the conversation, certainly all over Stanford's campus, the idea that these technologies are bringing about moral progress in addition to technological progress. Now, you couple that with the opposite side of the spectrum. If you've read Evgeny Morozov's recent book, which has the cheeky title, To Save the World, Click Here, or a brand new article, I think just out yesterday, by David Reif, called A Singularity of Fools, which is a review of these techno-utopian screeds. We have a public discourse that's evolving, which is on the one side relentlessly optimistic, and that if we all just get on board with the digital revolution, our lives will be transformed to the better. And then a bunch of all or nothing polemicists who are castigating the optimism that actually exists, where I think the commonsensical view, which my prediction is that almost all of you also share, but that is too infrequently expressed publicly, is that these digital technologies are neither inherently good nor inherently bad, have promise as well as peril, and unless we get the rules right, it could go in a bad way or it could go in a good way, which is why we think it's so important to attend to the overall structure of how this new world plays out. You don't have to be a relentless utopian nor a dystopian. Pay attention to the politics, which is why government is so important.
I claim no expertise on the rise of digital civil society, nor do I really claim any expertise on the other subject. But another trend that PACS thinks about a lot is the rise of private foundations, both in terms of numbers and assets. And both of these trends occurring simultaneously have pretty big implications for the way democracy functions. So I was just wondering if you think about those trends informing each other, or if you see any connections or interfaces between those two in terms of what they mean for democracy.
Sure. Well, I have a couple of thoughts about that. The first is an observation that the increasing number of private foundations It's not as if there's a cycle that occurs and every once in a while we get a bunch of new private foundations. The increase in the number of foundations is a more or less direct consequence of the growing wealth divide in the United States, where there's more and more concentration of wealth held at the very top end of the income distribution, which means those people have all that more luxury resource. And of course, with the social approbation that's attached to doing philanthropic work in a foundation, they're more and more inclined to do so. And when we get efforts like the Giving Pledge, which are noble and laudatory efforts, which confer social status on those people who pledge to give away at least 50% of their income in their lives, it just accelerates that trend. So what does it mean for democracy to have more and more private foundations? Well, I think there are a lot of things to be said about that, but I guess the thing I would want to call most attention to is the idea that private foundations are especially good or are designed to be good at one thing in particular, which is long time horizon work. So if you look at the for-profit commercial marketplace, a for-profit company has to satisfy investors or shareholders, and you have a relatively short time horizon to do that. In addition to your customers, if your customers stop buying what you have for sale, you go out of business fairly quickly. Similarly, in a democratic society, your politicians have relatively short time horizons because they have to show the positive effects to their constituency before the next election, else they don't get reelected. Foundations which are unaccountable in the marketplace and unaccountable at the election box are designed, it seems to me, to have longer time horizons of experimentation. And if they fail to think long and to experiment with social policy innovation or new ways of doing things with a longer time horizon, then it seems to me they don't fit as easily within democratic societies as they could, and they might not deserve some of the tax protections and other legal protections they now have. Let me give you one analogy, just so you don't think I'm trying to hold foundations to special account, to cast an eye sort of more inward at the kind of job that I have. So I occupy an unbelievably scarce resource in society that is also a very strange institutional design, which is I have tenure, lifetime job protection at an extraordinary university. And I think when you ask, well, what's the social purpose of tenure? Why would you set up a job arrangement which gave someone a job for life short of actually breaking the criminal law? If there's a good answer to that question, my own view is it has something to do with the social value of allowing some people within a university structure devoted to intellectual enterprises to think about questions that have a long time horizon and uncertain return. So set someone to work on climate change policy and brand new technological innovations that might make some headway. If you say, and we need it back in 6 weeks or by the next quarterly earning report, you just don't give the person enough leeway to do the kind of work that would actually be necessary. If you say, 10 years from now, we would like to have something, and in the meantime, go off and do your work, well then, perhaps tenure is good for something, because if you had to hold the person accountable on a 6-month basis or a yearly basis to what they actually produced, they might not be organized around that long time horizon. So the upshot of this is, if it turns out that tenured scholars are risk-averse, conservative, incremental, small ball scholarship, and that's what you get in universities, then we don't need the institution of tenure to protect their work. It could happen basically anywhere else in society. If you want scholarship that's engaged, risky, long time horizon work, then tenure might be a good idea to give those people the protection they need to have that speculative long time horizon work. Foundations are the equivalent of having tenure for dollars. So if you organize your dollars around long time horizon investments in social policy experimentation and innovation, then I have an optimism about the role that private foundations play in supporting democracies. Kim, you had a question?
Actually, it was more of a kind of a forecast question. Actually, it was going to be around, Rob really gave a great, here, I guess I need to use that. Rob gave a great overview now of a recent article that he has written called What Are Foundations For? And actually my question was very much on that subject. So I would encourage all of you to look at the Boston Review that recently came out, look up What Are Foundations For? And if you're actually going to be on campus on May 21st, there will be a public event with Rob in conversation with Larry Kramer, previous dean of Stanford Law School, now current president of the Hewlett Foundation, and one of our other visiting scholars, Susan Leoto, who is an expert on ethics, transparency, governance, and accountability, and then the wonderful postdoc who has been working with Rob and Lucy Chiara-Codelli. She will also be in conversation with them. So that was part of what I was going to actually ask you, so great. But I did actually have a question. You've also kind of the look ahead on this, you brought up the issue around morality and sort of philanthropy, digital goods, and morality. And coming up, you're also looking at this issue of philanthropy in the body. Is there any comment you would share on that? Because I think that's also a really interesting subject for this group to hear from you on.
Sure. So Kim is referring to a charrette we're hosting on May 16th, which is called Philanthropy in the Body. And we're looking at how the advances in the biological sciences and the digital realm are in fact changing not just the nature of the existing philanthropic systems that exist for the exchange of human tissue, organ donations, blood donations, things like that, but how in a digital age where the ability to make a significant contribution to public science, for example, requires little more than the donation of saliva taken with a cheek swab, because it's all, again, digitized. How are the lessons that are being learned by the experts in that realm of philanthropy in the body or organ donation and medical research, how are those lessons applicable to the broader philanthropic realm? And particularly talking about the human body is always a good place to raise what I think of as the hard, icky ethical questions. And we're definitely have been learning through the last year and will be learning going forward the ethical dimensions of some of these data capacities, as well as their limitations raised by the ethical issues. So that will be the next deep dive conversation from which Rob and I take what's learned and try to draw these broader ideas.
Okay, so you said there's rules about giving the money. And so when we go into the digital, will there be rules about giving data as philanthropy? So instead of giving grants, we're going to give data.
Again, it's already happening. So when you sign up on Genetic Alliance's website, and actually this is worth, if you're intrigued by this is a website worth taking a look at for a couple of reasons. But Genetic Alliance is a registry where you can contribute, you could literally contribute your personal information. That's a data donation right there. So the easy answer to your question, Beth, is yes, we're already doing it on a regular basis. Every time you sign into an event and give away your email address, you're donating data. But on the icky ethical question side of it, check out Genetic Alliance, because what you will find if you, and I think they're out of beta now and you could go through this, is a website that stops you at every click and asks you the equivalent of, are you sure you want to tell us that? Are you sure you want to tell us that? And what that is a website designed with your privacy first and foremost in mind. And it's an extraordinary experience. Whether or not you go through to contribute any of your personal medical history is obviously your choice. But it's an extraordinary experience because you will realize, it will make you realize how rarely your personal privacy is what greets you when you log on to the internet. But it can be done. They're building an extraordinary database for medical research of people's personal data that's just simply being given. So I'd say yes, we're already doing it. We're seeing companies donate their data to researchers. We're seeing things like the UN Global Pulse Initiative, which is using United Nations data and trying to figure out what are the larger public questions we can ask about that. So absolutely, we're already seeing data being donated. The tricky part, which we haven't gotten to yet, as a society, is putting a monetary value on those donations. Because, and lots of businesses and lots of accountants and lots of folks in finance are busy trying to put monetary value on data. And I believe as some kinds of standards start to emerge in that regard, that will have a significant effect on how we think about donated data.
So Rob, I want to come back to you and ask you a question around this idea around philanthropy and foundations and sort of the peril, if you will, that if, what is the danger if philanthropy continues in the same direction with the type of influence that foundations have? What are you worried about for our democracy? And if you were establishing a new government somewhere, what would you have them think about?
Well, I guess the initial thought that I have about this, I'd be curious to know whether it's a thought that you share. My guess is you don't have it in your head right now, but maybe once I say it, it'll seem familiar enough. The initial thought I have is that if you were building a democratic society from scratch, put yourself into the shoes of the founding fathers, and you were constructing from the ground up the institutional arrangements that you thought would be absolutely important for the democracy that you were creating to be a flourishing one. And now describe what the institutional form of a foundation is. Almost no accountability structure. You can install as the governing board your family as the trustees, and there's no internal mechanism either within the marketplace or within the election box to hold those people accountable. Very low transparency requirements because you only have to file this 990 form once a year with just a small amount of data. You don't have to have a website, a mailing address. You have to record what grants you made during the year, but really that just lives in this 990 form. You don't have to articulate a grant strategy. You don't have to have an evaluation of any of the grant making you do. So very low transparency requirements. A legal system that protects the intent of the donor, whatever the donor wishes to set the foundation up for, not merely for the lifetime of the donor, but forever in perpetuity, written into law, and then a raft of tax incentives designed to stimulate people to create such foundations. So you have an institutional form which is relatively unaccountable, requires almost no transparency, protects the preferences of the person who gives the money away forever, and allows the foundation to exist forever, and a slate of tax incentives to stimulate the creation of that. It's effectively, since foundations are virtually by definition the things that wealthy people do, it seems to me it's saying to the preferences of the preferences of people who are wealthy, let's allow you a special institutional form to devote your private assets in this unaccountable, non-transparent, eternal, tax-privileged way to have public influence in a democracy. Does that sound like one of the first things that would come to mind when you were creating the democratic society from scratch? My thought is that allowing a special privileged way for the preferences of the wealthy to have public impact is actually, on the surface, antithetical to democracy. Democracy is about the collective rule by citizens conceived as equals, not special influence for the wealthy. That's a plutocratic influence, not a democratic influence. So, as I say, on the surface, that's the way I would begin to worry about what it is a foundation is and what role it has in a democratic society. And the defense I gave before about seeing how foundations are distinctively able with this form, unlike the public institutions in a democracy and unlike the for-profit corporate operations in a democratic marketplace society, to think long, to have this long time horizon. And if you were setting democratic society up from scratch and you thought to yourself, we'd like some money to be oriented towards an uncertain long time horizon in the effort of policy experimentation and innovation, would that seem like a good thing? I think actually that would seem like a good thing. And if foundations actually are performing that role, then perhaps they deserve, in a democratic society, something like the institutional protections they now have. If by contrast, like the scholars I was describing before, they're risk-averse, small balls, short time horizon, relatively incremental things, then just write charitable checks from your checkbook or sort of set up a donor-advised fund. Don't make a foundation. It doesn't deserve the institutional protections that attach to it when you can certainly do virtually the same thing just by writing a check.
So that was a good commentary on the peril. So now let's talk about the promise of the digital civil society. That, does that open it up in some way and give you more comfort because, everything's on the internet, or there's this degree of transparency that gets created. And as you and Lucy move through these next steps of your research, how does that help you think about informing some of these issues?
Well, I think I started talking about 15, 20, 30 minutes ago about the promise of digital civil society with respect to Giving Tuesday. How if Henry Timms had imagined doing Giving Tuesday as a 92nd Street Y, flyer effort, given the quality of the people there, I'm sure it would have been successful in a really hyper-local way. What the digital nature of this permits is that virtually the identical labor devoted now in an online way created 2,700 partnerships, millions of additional dollars in contributions, a kind of awareness that spread not merely across the United States, but across the globe, and that's where Giving Tuesday is headed next, in a global direction, that would have been impossible to have carried out without a single paid employee if they had been passing out flyers. So the promise of digital civil society is the unbelievably low cost to enormous scale in a very, very short time horizon. It's a decentralized way of imagining power and community working at large scale. And that's something that it's really important to get the rules right so data can be deployed in that direction without some of the peril that we've also been talking about.
Lucy, anything to add?
Well, I'm very split on this question. Rob and I were having a conversation earlier about this literature that's emerging, the utopian versus dystopian literature about the digital future. And I actually, since I read all this stuff, I actually organized my bookshelf along that spectrum. And I'll tell you, and I said this to Rob, I think we're letting the publishers and the editors off the hook here because they know what sells. So I'm not so sure that the writers of those books are as one way or the other on this. I'm much more in the middle, and I'll give you an example. I actually think we just don't really know how we can use these technologies more for good than for evil. The Digital Public Library of America, which is a fascinating effort initiated by the University Librarian of Harvard and launched last week, is just I'll just tell you a very short story. This is a virtual repository of metadata. I can't think of anything less interesting. There is actually not a single book in the Digital Public Library of America. There's no book there. It's a pointer to library collections. It's a common set of finding terms, if you will. It's a very complicated piece of software code. But we were going to have a launch party for it. I had purchased my tickets. I was going to the party. I was flying across country. Unfortunately, the launch party was set for Boston last week, so the launch party was canceled. Because there are people there with a shared vision, and it's the Digital Public Library of America, but I counted the other day, and I found 192 national digital libraries. So it's not alone, and it's designed to connect to all of those things. And we were all going to gather at the Boston Public Library, and we will later in the fall, as tangible people. So there's something very interesting going on here. I mean, here's a bunch of people buying plane tickets and planning to cross the country to go hang out in a beautiful physical space with the requisite library lions. I mean, they're not as nice as Patience and Fortitude, but they're pretty good, the ones they have in Boston. For a virtual repository of metadata. I mean, my son looked at me like I was crazy. But this is what's happening. We are finding ways to connect and scale and interweave, I guess, is probably the right verb, some basic human desires, which is to do things together on behalf of someone else. That's what's at the root of all of this. Rob and I call it the use of private resources for public good, but that's fancy talk for let's get together and do something that benefits other people. And digital technologies have with them these innate characteristics that we're starting to understand about how they move and how they last and who owns them and how they can last forever and how they can be morphed and all this other stuff. And we're running along to catch up. And I think the message of the ReCoding Good project is let's think about the rules of the game here. Let's think about what we value in that basic civic life, associational, expressionist possibility so that we don't lose any of that, that we get more good than bad from what we're adding to our repertoire here.
Great, thank you. Any other final comments? I realize we're actually a moment or two over.
Let's chat and mix and mingle.
Great. Thank you all for being, thank you for being tangible people who are here tonight. Thank you for that, Lucy. And will you please join me in thanking the tangible scholars that we have with us, Lucy and Rob. And in closing, I need to also very specifically thank Jim Friend, who took the leadership with the Stanford Alumni Association here in New York and has been our partner on calls, and then, of course, and planning and everything else. And then, of course, Henry, where are you? Hello, thank you. This was just a fantastic opportunity for us to be at the 92nd Street Y Tribeca to celebrate the remarkable success of Giving Tuesday and how all of that fits in so beautifully with ReCoding Good for the 21st century. So if you want to continue the conversation, pound PACS NYC and tweet away, or come to our website and come to both PACS and SSIR and join us on an ongoing basis. Thank you for joining us.